Well, good morning. It's great to see everybody. As Darren was talking about how eloquent I am, it made me think, I wonder who's the bigger sinner. Is it Darren for exaggerating or me for enjoying it so much? It's probably me. The mission statement for the Church on the Square is revive the church, reach the city, and renew the culture. And last week I said that this mission statement is an attempt to summarize the principles which are to animate this local body. And last week we began a series of lessons designed to unpack each of these directives that we're calling the church in the late modern world. And what I hope to do ultimately in this lesson is to try to bridge the second and the third principles by discussing the importance of the city, both in the spreading of the gospel and in the more the broader project, which is the renewing of culture. And really what I want to do is once again demonstrate that the gospel is a lot broader than what much of Western Christendom has thought, that it encompasses a lot more than just the forgiveness of sins. That the good news in its greatest sense is God making all things new. We might call it the extreme makeover cosmic edition, in which God creates a new heavens and a new earth, a renewed dwelling place for himself and man. And it also includes, as we said last week, a return of the image bearer to his true vocation as ruling priest. The piece of this I wish to make manifest this morning is that at the heart of this renewal is a city. Our text is Revelation 21, verses 1 through 5, which says this. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain. For the old order of things has passed away." He who is seated on the throne said, "I am making all things new." As we noted last week, Christians spent much of the 20th century withdrawing, in large measure, from America's most influential institutions, cultural centers which were primarily located in urban areas. And as a result of this loss of cultural influence, or perhaps maybe we should say as at least part due to it, we as Christians have tended to be anti-urban, to view cities at best as inconsequential to the spread of the gospel, and at worst as a negative force of undermining belief and morality. The paradigmatic examples being the city of Babel and Sodom and Gomorrah, the very height of human hubris and debauchery. And so we, and by that I mean primarily Bible Belt Christians, have tended to roll our eyes when someone mentions San Francisco or Los Angeles, while at the same time apparently forgetting that the prophet Jonah was sent to save the much more wicked city of Nineveh. In fact, when most Americans were flocking to urban areas, what sociologists call the rural exodus, Christianity was beginning in many ways to become a rural or suburban movement. But that certainly wasn't the case in the beginning. The early evangelists saw cities as high-value targets in their missional strategy, a fact which becomes evident as one works his way through the book of Acts. For example, in Acts 17, Paul travels to Athens, which was, of course, at the time the intellectual epicenter of the Greco-Roman world. In fact, he even ends up at Mars Hill, at the Areopagus, defending Christianity. Then in Acts 18, the apostle journeys to one of the Roman Empire's chief commercial centers, Corinth. Paul then moves to Ephesus in Acts 19, which was a major religious center. And then by the end of the book, Paul has made his way to Rome, the capital of military and political power. As John Stott has said, Paul's deliberate policy seems to have been to move from one strategic city center to the next. Now, while this was not, of course, the sole strategy for the building of the kingdom, the point is that it certainly was a major piece of it. The question I have this morning is why? Why was this the case? Why were cities so important to the spread of Christianity? And must they play a similar role for us today? Now, in order to answer such questions, it's helpful to understand the notion of a city from an ancient or biblical point of view. Rather than defining city based on population size, as is common today, in the ancient world, the word city made reference to the population's density. And so it was essentially a social construction whereby people lived in close proximity to one another. Harvard economist Edward Glaser defines city in a similar way. He defines it as the absence of physical space between people, which may seem like a weird definition of a city, but it helps point us in the direction of the ancient notion. The Hebrew word for city, the Old Testament, by the way, is written in Hebrew originally, but the Hebrew word for city refers to essentially a densely populated group that's living within city walls. And Psalm 122, verse 3 may capture this idea because it could be translated as follows: Jerusalem, built as a city should be, compacted together. Ancient cities were, in fact, heavily concentrated. In fact, and this just amazes me, but on average, the average ancient city was 2.5 times as densely populated as New York City. Okay? Now, I'm not saying it has as many people, but I'm talking about the population density, 2.5 times. If you've ever been to New York, you've been to Manhattan, walked around, there seems like there's a lot of people that live in Manhattan, and that's in high-rises mostly. This is before there are high-rises. So this kind of density is more like places today of Dhaka, Bangladesh, or Mumbai, India. The densest place that I've ever been is Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And interestingly, I looked it up, and it wasn't even on the top 20 list of most dense cities. And I think that's because the downtown area is a no-go zone for almost all of the citizens. But the people just surround the city, and I'd never had seen that many people before. They were literally on top of one another. And being someone who is more than mildly claustrophobic, I found it to be rather suffocating. In fact, I'll let you in on a secret. One of my great nightmares that I actually lose sleep over is being forced to ride on a bus in Africa. If you've ever been to Africa, you know what it's like on the buses. The people are they're cheek to cheek. Literally, they stuff people in there. But it's interesting, people who grow up there and then move to America, where we obviously have much greater personal space, they find that openness to be isolating. But that's all of an aside. The point being is that this kind of close proximity, though, can create an energy and a productivity that is very difficult to replicate in rural areas. And this remains true today. Corporations will absorb much higher operating costs, keeping workers in city centers, because it often translates to greater productivity. In other words, there's often a cultural intensity to the cities that just isn't present in rural communities where there's a more dispersed population. Also, because the city was fortified by walls, it offered its residents greater safety and stability, which was important because there was much in the ancient world which threatened human flourishing. Things like invading armies and robbers and blood-feud avengers, deadly animals, etc. And so living within the city gates provided greater protection from these threats, and therefore then it created greater stability. And so it's not surprising then that the Bible routinely uses the city as a metaphor for refuge and for confidence. An interesting example of this is Proverbs 21, verse 22. It speaks to what we talked about last week, but this time in the Old Testament. It says, "One who is wise can go up against the city of the mighty and pull down the stronghold in which they trust." So you see it's using the metaphor of the city walls as something that someone trusts in. In this case, it's their own ideology that they trust in, their own foolishness. And the wise person is able to fulfill the cultural mandate and go and tear down those walls, which is what Paul talks about. Paul's idea seems to be that people get trapped in these ideological prisons, and that by tearing them down and revealing the truth, we free them from those prisons. The point I'm making, though, here is that the city walls fostered the confidence necessary for the community to experience peace and prosperity. Absent this kind of confidence, prosperity was hard to come by. Finally, the biblical understanding of a city implies greater diversity. Minority groups tended to be more vulnerable to persecution and to mistreatment just by the simple fact that there were less of them. And thus they were attracted to the safety and stability of the cities, and they were also attracted, as they still are today, to the economic advantages of the cities. In the church at Antioch, for example, we see leaders from different ethnic groups in Acts 13, verse 1, which is exactly what should happen when the gospel goes forth in cities where there are people of different people groups. So a city's density now, its density, its stability, and its diversity that we just discussed had many benefits for the city dweller. Ones which, as I said, made cities more culturally potent than any other living arrangement. And I want to highlight just a couple of these. The first is that systems of law and order developed first in cities. And if you think about it, this makes sense. Outside the city walls, disputes in the ancient world were settled by the sword. This led to long-standing feuds and social disorder. And you know, it's interesting, we have feuds today in our country. It seems quite divided when we think of ideology. And we are feuding back and forth, but imagine what those feuds would be like if there was no rule of law at all. And we're getting some glimpses, perhaps, of that in the last few days. But the stability of a city made it possible to develop a system of jurisprudence, where matters could be settled fairly and without bloodshed. At the gates of the city, for example, the elders would gather to hear cases and to make rulings. And we can also think of the cities of refuge that God commanded the Israelites to create. These were places where someone could come and get a fair trial, we might say, where they could come and plead their case. These are the original sanctuary cities. Interestingly, modern sanctuary cities seem to be places where the rule of law doesn't apply. It seems actually to be the reverse of the biblical idea. But just consider this for a minute. Just the opportunity to have laws was a huge advantage to the city dweller. This is hard for the modern person to relate to. It's hard for them to relate to why the Bible raves about what a blessing law is, right? How can James describe law as something that sets you free? And why that's strange is because if you're drunk on the notion of autonomous freedom as being the ultimate freedom, then every time you hear law, it's just kind of a buzzkill, really. But this is only because we've never experienced the enslavement of lawlessness. Just ask the people of Yemen, which is a city that's been devastated by civil war for the last 4 years, how valuable the rule of law is, how much they desire it. Ask them how much freedom they are experiencing in their lawlessness. This stability and diversity also promotes commerce. The Republic of Zimbabwe is an excellent example of this. Zimbabwe is a country located in the south-central part of the continent, and it's a country rich in natural resources. In fact, it was once called the breadbasket of Africa. Now, that lofty title might be hyperbolic, might be part of their marketing. But still, under the unstable dictatorship of President Robert Mugabe, the agricultural industry collapsed in this country, and outside investors lost all interest, except for China, who's come in and exploited the nation. But the point being is that there was too much instability in the government to promote a thriving economy. And so the stability of the city in the ancient world created essentially economic order. What was also created is the idea of the agora, which is the marketplace, which is where consumers and producers can come together in one place, which leads then to specialization, which leads then to further increases in quality and productivity, and on we go. One last benefit of ancient cities is that they were places of greater innovation. Human culture, like technology and architecture, the arts, etc., really began to flourish when cities were built. In Genesis chapter 4, immediately after Cain essentially establishes the first city, which certainly was not under ideal circumstances, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But once he establishes the first city, we see the development of the arts in music in Genesis 4:21, and of technology and tool making in chapter 4, verse 22. Cities, in other words, are the seat of innovation. The more people who come together of the same profession, the more they sharpen one another and stimulate new ideas. The old Frank Sinatra song that talks about New York City, if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere, right? It's sort of the mecca toward which all aspiring artists want to make a pilgrimage, right? I was actually a musician for a number of years, and one of our jokes, I was in upstate New York, but one of our jokes was always that these young aspiring musicians would travel to New York, right, with these great aspirations of becoming a professional musician, and they'd ride the subway, and they'd get off the subway, and there'd be some guy playing guitar in the subway for free, and he was 100 times better than the guy that was riding the subway, and their dreams were killed instantaneously, right? But that's it's just what happens, is people flock to these cultural centers, and the innovation is incredible. And so the point being, rural areas in ancient times could not provide and sustain all of these advantages: civil order, economic order, and cultural order. And they could then not keep pace with the productivity and innovation that such advantages provided. It was the cities where one found the most vibrant cultivation. And this is still largely true today, it seems to me. It's slightly less so, perhaps, because we have, at least in America, stability and security in rural communities and suburban areas. You know, it's possible to build a Dell computer in Round Rock, although these do tend to be suburban. They tend to be right on the heels of a major metropolitan area. So it's not exactly the same, but I think it's still the case that cultural centers are most often found in densely populated areas. So given this, what we've said, it's no wonder then that Christians made the cities of the Greco-Roman Empire primary targets for the gospel. First of all, that's where most of the people were. But in addition to that, in a village, one might be able to woo one or two artists to the beauty of Christ. But if you want to change the industry, you have to go to the city where the leaders are and where the schools reside. And as we said last week, it's just a fact that Christianity transformed the culture in no small part by converting the cultural elites of the day, by taking over these cultural centers. Interestingly, in my reading, there's a book by Richard Fletcher, which is called The Barbarian Conversion, which deals with the Christian mission to Europe from AD 500 to AD 1500, and he notes exactly the same thing. So it was true in the early centuries, it was true from 500 to 1500, this idea of taking over, the importance of taking over cultural centers, and I think it's still true today. Secondly, in a village, you will likely win over people from one people group. Rural communities tend, in other words, to be demographically homogenized. In a city, you can win over lots of people groups due to the diversity that we talked about. And when these people groups travel back to their hometowns, the message then spreads. It was true in the first century, certainly. That's why all the Jews and Greeks who lived in the province of Asia heard the word of the Lord without any record of Paul personally traveling to all of these cities. In fact, many people think that the Roman church was planted by individuals who were in Jerusalem on Pentecost, as is listed there in Acts chapter 2, and then they eventually traveled home and planted a church there. Thirdly, people who live in villages tend to be more resistant to change. Now, I might get some pushback on this, but I think this is true due to the lack of stability and creativity, and maybe mostly today due to a lack of exposure to diverse views. Rural areas tend to be more doctrinally homogenized, we might say. The thing is, people in densely populated areas are more open to new ideas, I think. Most Christians I know, and I used to think this way, think the opposite is true, that the people in cities are hardened and they're nearly impossible to reach. That might be, as a result of some of that anti-urban perspective that I talked about before. But many people think that it's easier to convert people in rural areas, but as I think about this more and from my more recent experience, I don't think this is actually right. I think that people in cities tend to be more open-minded because they have to be. They are surrounded by many competing views. They cannot live in an echo chamber. It's almost impossible. And so their confidence in their own view tends to be less. What I find in very rural areas, and this is not a knock on rural areas, but I think it's the case, is that people are still holding to the exact same worldview that they were taught from the time of infancy, right? I mean, they hold to the same principles that their family held to, and they've never actually been challenged on any of it, right? You can live your whole life in a community and never have your worldview even challenged. I mean, you can actually think in your mind, and ask yourself this question, you can actually think that it's like there's no chance whatsoever that your worldview is false. You might have absolute 100% philosophical certainty that your worldview is true. What I would say to you as someone who's changed their worldview multiple times is that there is no such philosophical certainty. We're never convinced of anything at 100%. And it might be a sign that you haven't really had your worldview challenged, and it may not be as robust. That's the issue. I mean, that's one of the things that City does, is it brings together these worldviews, and there's this clash of ideas, and it sharpens them, right? That's the purpose of debate. Debate is really the purpose is to get to the truth, people say, but it seems to be more that it's just to sharpen each other's positions, as iron sharpens iron. So I think in the cities, people, their confidence is less because they've been confronted by other worldviews. We live in a time of great pluralism, at least in the more urban areas, and this can undermine your confidence, which means you're more open to other ideas. Okay, having said all of that, I think that there might be, though, an even more fundamental reason why Christians should include cities in their renovation project. And that's because a flourishing city was actually the end goal of creation itself. The end of the cultural mandate, in other words, I think, was to develop Eden into a thriving metropolis. That when God's creational and redemptive intentions were fully realized, the end result would have been a holy city, what Jerusalem and indeed every city is just a shadow of. Now, this vision is not the work of my own imagination, at least not fundamentally, but is instead cast by the inspired writers of Scripture, beginning with the Old Testament prophets and ending in the Apocalypse of John, where it's given its most vivid description. So we go back to our text of Revelation 21, starting in verse 1. And remember that this book of Revelation, that word revelation comes from the Greek word apokalypto. You think of the coming apocalypse, but the origins of that word and how it's used in the Bible has to do with this idea of revealing. It's the pulling back of the curtain or the removing of the veil. So here's John, and God is revealing to him things that are going to come in the future. And in this case, it's at the end of the age, that which is going to come. Again, Revelation 21, verse 1, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throng saying, 'Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. And it goes on to say, and I'm going to make all things new. So this is a proclamation of the gospel, it seems to me, in its broadest sense. This is God creating a new dwelling place for himself and for his image bearer, this holy city, where we can become God's people and he can become our God. Then in chapter 22 in verse 1 it says, and the angel showed me the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb down the middle of the great street of the city. On each side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be any curse. The throne of God and of the Lamb will be in the city, and his servants will serve him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. There will be no more night. They will not need the light of a lamp or the light of the sun, for the Lord God will give them light, and they will reign forever and ever. So this is the new Jerusalem. This is the eternal abode of God and man. It's a city, notice, which has been built in a familiar place. Did you recognize it as we were reading it? Right? It's the same location as the garden that you read about in the opening chapters of Genesis. This is how the Bible, the 66 books of inspired text, begin and end. This is how it's bookended. It's the same river, the same tree that's there. But notice now it's been expanded and it's been remade into God's garden city. A place which perfectly balances the glorious benefits that we discussed of human density. In Revelation 7, it talks about a great multitude of worshipers who are gathered around God's throne. And also human diversity from every nation, tribe, people, and language. In addition, it offers safety and stability, where there's no more pain, no more sorrow, no more sickness, no more death, no more war between the nations. The lion and the lamb will lie down together, we're told. It's a place that combines those glorious benefits of human density and diversity and stability with the beauty and peace of nature. The river of life literally runs down Main Street, we're told. So this is the Garden of Eden fully cultivated. Interestingly, the word garden in Genesis 2 can denote a park rather than a wilderness. In other words, a well-tended plot of land that one would find in a city or a palace. This is like Central Park. Many Christians assume in the West that the final goal of Christ's redemption is a return to a rural, Edenic kind of world. In fact, many Christians tend to think of heaven in a very Platonic sense, even sort of a Greek dualism, where we're, souls that have been severed from our body and we're just sort of floating around, and this sort of ethereal vision of floating on clouds and playing harps for all eternity. That's certainly the popular image of heaven, which for many unbelievers, and even for many believers, it seems a rather inane existence, this sort of just ethereal kind of existence. In other words, many fail to see the vision of the new heavens and the new earth. But even among those Christians who grasp what we might call this hyper-material vision, they still tend to think of it as a rural setting. And then based on that assumption, the work of Christians is then limited to essentially just evangelism and disciple making while we are here, rather than the much broader notion of cultivation. But Revelation informs us that God's intention for human endeavor is that it raise up civilizations that glorify Him and steward the endless wonders and riches that God put into the created world. And the city is the telos of that work. It's the end of it, what human beings were intended to create. Now, this glorious vision is, of course, set against the city of Babel in the narrative of the Bible, which represents the corruption of man's vocation by pride and greed. The unholy city, which is man's futile attempt to become like God. The lie that the serpent whispered into Eve's ear in the beginning, this empty promise of autonomous freedom, that when it was believed led to banishment from the garden. But here's the thing that occurred to me, is that man apparently is a builder by nature. So even though he's kicked off the building site, we might say, he continues the project anyway. This is Cain building the first city, and in the Genesis narrative, such futile activities climax in the Tower of Babel. Come, let us build ourselves a city, they say, with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves, not a name for God. And therefore, I think the Bible can be summed up as a tale of two cities. The city of God and the city of man. The New Jerusalem and the city of Babel. And it also seems to me that this is why, when you look at a city today, it has a dual nature, you might say, just like man has a dual nature. Cities today are places which are glorious on the one hand and wretched on the other. Places which provide both human flourishing and human corruption simultaneously. And the recent events, just yesterday, it seems to speak to this duality, right? On the one hand, we put a man on a rocket and sent him up into space. We've built this international space station, which seems to me is fulfilling this mandate to go and subdue the earth. That might be the greatest expression or fulfillment of that command that man has accomplished. So we have this incredible accomplishment by man, which brings glory to God. Who is this God who has created man and given him the ability to create in this way, to innovate in this way? And yet at the same time, there are those who want to burn Minneapolis to the ground. The world that we live in, the cities that we live in, have this dual nature to them. And thus, like the rest of creation, they cry out for redemption. And ultimately, that renewal in its complete sense will not come until the children of God are revealed, as it says in Romans 8, when the chief architect and builder returns. And that's what our text in Revelation 21 and 22 is talking about. When this dilapidated world will finally be renovated and become a place where God's people can thrive in peace and productivity that's discussed in Revelation 18. So notice that this is not some kind of utopian vision that I'm promoting. I mean, if the 20th century has taught us anything, it's that utopia in this age is impossible. And that, in fact, to think and act as if it is possible leads civilization to the brink of utter destruction, as Friedrich Nietzsche predicted it would. Because it's built on this system which says that any action, regardless of how abominable, is permitted as long as it serves the end goal of utopia. The Christian view of the future protects us from the allure of this false vision. By the way, it's not just in the 20th century that utopian visions have been popular. You see it throughout the history of the human race. But the Christian view of the future protects us from it because in the Christian story, Christ is the prime mover, not man. And all things will not be made new in a complete sense until he returns. But here's the point. The project of recreation, though, has begun. It began in Acts chapter 2 with the coming of the Spirit, who came and raised us from spiritual death, who set us free from our bondage to sin, who comes and indwells within us and empowers us. And having been set free from that bondage to the evil one, our vocation then has been restored. And thus Christians should be leading the way in the cultivation of our cities. We should be leading the way in innovation, in the arts, and on we go, technology and the rest. Engaging not just in a project of creation, as we said last week, but also recreation, restoring that which is ruined, mending that which is broken, recovering that which is lost, setting free the captives, those imprisoned by false ideologies. And here's another thing. Our worldview allows us to take the risks necessary to accomplish these things. in one sense, we have nothing to lose. We have everything to gain. These are the works, it seems to me, that God had prepared beforehand that we might walk in them, as it says in Ephesians 2. And by the way, this work continues in the new heavens and the new earth, as we read about in Revelation 22. As we're gathered around God's throne, we are servants of God. We are doing things, we're doing service. It seems to me that we're cultivating. In addition to this, a flourishing city, a holy city, acts as a signpost, pointing us to the coming New Jerusalem. It's a foretaste of eternal life, which will be a time of maximal cultivation, an era of perfect civil, economic, and cultural order. So let me bring this to a close. Let me try to draw together these various threads by using Georgetown as an example, by discussing what is it about Georgetown that makes me think it's a strategic location for this kind of renewal. The first thing to say is that the city of Georgetown already gives us glimpses of the eternal city. There's no doubt. There is so much taking place in this town that must not just be affirmed by Christians, but commended by us. In many ways, in fact, we are, of all people that have ever lived, some of the most fortunate people. The kind of prosperity that we experience. I mean, I was, reading Charles Dickens, yesterday, and it just reminded me again, 100, 150 years ago, things were dramatically different than they are now. So a correction to becoming distorted in our vision is to remind ourselves of how far we've come and how prosperous life really is, at least in this country. But there are areas which require transformation. For example, there are many people who have yet to receive the Spirit in this city, have yet to receive all of the spiritual blessings that God has to offer. In addition, I think the ethical foundations which have fostered our present prosperity have been eroded. They're gone. And that this in time will lead to sweeping changes, some of which, as we noted last week, have already begun. My fear is that barbarism is crouching at the door, and we must do our best to resist it. And recent events remind us of how quickly things can devolve into utter chaos. But this will require a reappropriation of Christian ethics. We're going to have to put the foundation back. Now, there are several things about Georgetown which make it a strategic location for such renewal efforts. Let me just mention a couple. Firstly, this city is in some ways the cultural center of Williamson County. Certainly this is true in terms of government, but also I would argue that it's true in terms of the arts and other forms of high culture. And we are also one of the fastest growing cities in the world. One of the fastest growing cities. People are migrating here from all over the United States, even from various parts of the world. And thus Georgetown has a growing density and diversity, and this creates a bigger stage for the Christian message. People from all over the world are coming to us, which is a huge advantage. And this also increases our influence around the world, because one day many of these individuals will go back to their homelands or to their hometowns or to other places, and if we can convince them of the truth of the Christian religion, they will take that with them. So those are just two of the unique opportunities that I see in this city, and we'll talk about more in the coming weeks. The last thing to say is that next week what I want to discuss is the foundation of this urban renewal, and that is the subject of conversion. At the heart of everything that this church is going to do is the proclamation of the gospel, and even the proclamation and the reception of the gospel in individual people.